Imagine an entire civilization, more advanced than anything in the ancient world, vanishing beneath the ocean in a single day and night. No survivors to tell the tale, no ruins left to discover, just whispers in ancient texts and a mystery that has consumed humanity for over 2,000 years. This is the story of Atlantis. And before you dismiss it as pure fantasy, consider this. Every detail we know comes from one of history's greatest philosophers, writing in meticulous detail about a civilization he claimed really existed. The descriptions are so specific, so precise, that they've launched thousands of expeditions and convinced some of the world's brightest minds that somewhere beneath the waves, the truth is waiting. I've spent months diving into ancient texts, archaeological reports, and geological surveys. What I've found is stranger than I expected. Not because Atlantis is real, but because the line between myth and history is far blurrier than you might think. Have you ever wondered why certain stories refuse to die? Why we're drawn to tales of lost civilizations and forgotten wisdom? Drop a comment, because this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries might change how you think about the stories we tell ourselves. This is the search for Atlantis. And whether it's myth, legend, or forgotten truth, the answer reveals something profound about human nature itself. Our story doesn't begin in the depths of the ocean or through archaeological discovery. It begins in ancient Athens around 360 BC in the marble halls of Plato's academy. Plato, one of Western civilization's most influential philosophers, wrote two dialogues that would spark millennia of debate, the Timaeus and Critias. These works represent the sole ancient source for what would become one of history's most enduring mysteries. Here's what makes this fascinating. Plato wasn't a fantasy writer. He was a rigorous thinker whose works shaped mathematics, political theory, and ethics. Yet he chose to tell this story with the same careful detail he applied to his most serious philosophical arguments. The account emerges through Critias, a character based on Plato's great-grandfather, who claims the tale came through an unbroken chain of oral tradition. According to this narrative, the Athenian lawgiver Solon had traveled to Egypt around 500 to 90 BC. There, Egyptian priests in the city of Sais revealed ancient records of a great civilization that had existed 9,000 years before their time. Think about that timeline for a moment. These priests claimed to possess records spanning millennia, describing a powerful island nation that had threatened the known world before vanishing beneath the waves in a single catastrophic day and night. Plato's description is remarkably detailed, almost suspiciously so, for a story supposedly passed down through generations. Atlantis, he wrote, was an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This geographical placement positioned it in the Atlantic Ocean, in waters that allegedly became impossible to navigate after the island's destruction due to shallow mud left by the catastrophe. The physical layout was extraordinary. The city consisted of alternating rings of land and water, with the central island measuring approximately 5.7 miles in diameter. These concentric circles were connected by tunnels large enough for ships to pass through, creating an intricate system of harbors and waterways. Massive walls surrounded each ring. The outer wall was covered in brass, the middle wall coated in tin, and the innermost wall gleaming with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato described as second in value only to gold. Imagine the spectacle. These metallic surfaces reflecting sunlight across the harbour, visible from vast distances at sea. At the heart of the city stood the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon. This temple, 600 feet long, 300 feet wide, and proportionally tall, was constructed entirely of silver, except for its golden pinnacles. Inside, a colossal gold statue of Poseidon, driving 6 winged horses, dominated the interior, reaching nearly to the ceiling. The society that inhabited this marvel operated under a unique governmental system. 10 kings, all descendants of Atlas, Poseidon's firstborn son, ruled different regions of the island. These rulers gathered every 5th and 6th year alternately in Poseidon's temple to deliberate on common matters and judge infractions of their sacred laws. The military capabilities were staggering. Plato provides specific numbers: 60,000 leaders, 120,000 hoplites, 180,000 archers, 180,000 slingers, 300,000 javelin men, 240,000 horsemen, and 60,000 chariots. The naval forces included 1,200 ships, each carrying 200 men. These figures suggest a total military force exceeding 1 million men, supported by a civilian population in the tens of millions. The economic foundation rested on extraordinary natural abundance. The fertile plains produced 2 harvests annually, watered by winter rains and summer irrigation through an elaborate canal system. A main canal, 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and over 1,000 miles long, connected the capital to the sea. But beneath this prosperity, Plato wove a narrative of moral decline. Initially, the Atlanteans embodied virtue and wisdom, their divine heritage manifesting in just governance. However, as generations passed and divine blood became diluted through intermarriage with mortals, their character deteriorated. They became consumed with material wealth and imperial expansion. This transformation, from virtue to corruption, represents the philosophical core of Plato's account. And it's here that scholars begin to question: was Plato describing a real place or crafting an elaborate allegory? Within Plato's own lifetime, his most distinguished student rejected the story entirely. Aristotle, perhaps the most systematic and empirically minded philosopher of ancient Greece, declared that the man who dreamed it up made it vanish. This wasn't casual skepticism. It reflected a fundamental disagreement about the relationship between philosophical instruction and factual accuracy. Several factors suggest Plato conceived Atlantis as allegory rather than history. The account appears exclusively in his works, with no corroborating evidence from other ancient sources who would have had access to the same Egyptian records. The detailed numerical specifications display the systematic precision characteristic of Plato's theoretical constructions rather than the approximate estimates typical of historical accounts. Furthermore, the Atlantis story serves specific philosophical purposes. The contrast between virtuous ancient Athens and corrupt Atlantis mirrors the distinction between the ideal state described in Plato's Republic and the degenerate democracies he criticized in contemporary Greece. Herodotus, writing his histories in the mid-5th century BC, demonstrated exhaustive curiosity about distant lands and ancient civilizations. His accounts encompass regions from Scythia to Ethiopia. Yet nowhere in his comprehensive survey does he mention any tradition resembling the Atlantis story, despite his documented fascination with Egyptian wisdom. Similarly, Thucydides, whose history of the Peloponnesian War established new standards for historical accuracy, makes no reference to any ancient Athenian victory over a Western maritime empire. Given his meticulous attention to Athenian traditions, this omission carries particular weight. Yet the possibility remains that Plato drew inspiration from actual historical events even while crafting a primarily allegorical narrative. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC had witnessed the sudden disappearance of several advanced civilizations. Memories of these catastrophes might have survived in oral traditions, providing historical foundation for Plato's fictional elaboration. For nearly a millennium, Atlantis effectively vanished from European consciousness, not beneath ocean waves, but into the darkness of lost manuscripts. The collapse of classical learning institutions across Western Europe during the 5th and 6th centuries created an intellectual vacuum. As barbarian invasions disrupted trade networks and urban centers, the elaborate manuscript copying operations that had sustained classical literature began to disintegrate. In this environment, the complete works of Plato, including the dialogues containing the Atlantis narrative, effectively disappeared from Western European libraries. The Timaeus existed in partial Latin translation, but this translation ended abruptly at the point where Plato begins his detailed description of Atlantis. This textual gap created a peculiar situation. Educated Europeans possessed theoretical knowledge about Plato's philosophical importance, while remaining largely ignorant of his specific teachings. Medieval encyclopedists acknowledged Plato's significance, yet their discussions relied on second-hand summaries rather than direct textual engagement. The few references to lost civilizations in medieval literature typically derived from biblical sources rather than classical Greek philosophy. Medieval chroniclers showed considerable interest in antediluvian history and pre-Christian civilizations, but their investigations drew primarily from Genesis and early Christian historical works. The scholastic movement of the 12th and 13th centuries, despite its sophisticated engagement with classical texts, continued to lack access to the complete Platonic corpus. Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica demonstrated remarkable familiarity with Aristotelian philosophy, showed no knowledge of the Atlantis narrative. Byzantine scholars maintained superior access to Greek philosophical texts throughout the medieval period. Yet even their libraries appear to have suffered significant losses. References to Atlantis remain notably absent from Byzantine historical and geographical literature. The absence becomes particularly striking when contrasted with the period's fascination with geographical speculation and legendary lands. Medieval writers displayed intense curiosity about distant regions, mythical islands, and lost civilizations. The intellectual appetite clearly existed for narratives like the Atlantis story, yet the specific Platonic account remained unavailable. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 accelerated the recovery of classical Greek texts by forcing scholars westward, carrying manuscript collections that had survived in Eastern libraries. Among these recovered texts were complete versions of Plato's dialogues. Marsilio Ficino's monumental Latin translation of Plato's complete works, completed in Florence around 1484, marked the decisive moment in Atlantis's return to European consciousness. Working under Cosimo de' Medici's patronage, Ficino made Platonic texts accessible to educated Europeans for the first time in nearly a millennium. Ficino understood Atlantis as a complex allegorical framework encoding profound truths about human nature and divine providence. His commentary emphasized the moral dimensions, interpreting the rise and fall of Atlantis as an illustration of the eternal conflict between spiritual and material values. The Medici court's intellectual environment proved particularly receptive. Renaissance humanists, acutely conscious of their civilization's relationship to classical antiquity, found in the Atlantis story a powerful metaphor for the recovery and loss of cultural achievement. The printing revolution of the late 15th century dramatically expanded access to Ficino's translations. The 1491 Venetian edition, produced by Aldus Manutius, exemplified the new technology's capacity to disseminate classical texts with unprecedented speed. Within decades, educated Europeans from London to Prague possessed access to complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias. The rediscovery coincided remarkably with the age of exploration. Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic Ocean began within a decade of Ficino's translation project. This timing proved crucial for subsequent interpretations, as European scholars suddenly possessed both access to Plato's complete account and contemporary evidence of previously unknown lands beyond the Atlantic. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire provided particularly compelling material for Atlantis speculation. Hernán Cortés's letters describing Tenochtitlan's sophisticated urban planning, elaborate water management systems, and vast wealth immediately reminded educated Europeans of Plato's description of the Atlantean capital. The city's location on an island connected to the mainland by causeways, its complex system of canals and harbors, and its impressive architectural achievements all seem to echo specific details from the Critias dialogue. Francisco López de Gómara's Historia General de las Indias, published in 1552, made explicit connections between newly discovered American civilizations and Plato's Atlantis narrative. He argued that the advanced indigenous cultures encountered by Spanish conquistadors provided concrete evidence that sophisticated civilizations had indeed existed in the Atlantic region. The geographical location of the Americas relative to the Mediterranean world also seemed to support Platonic accuracy. The positioning of the New World beyond the Strait of Gibraltar corresponded precisely to Plato's description of Atlantis as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's Historia General de las Indias offered systematic analysis of parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities. Oviedo, who spent decades in the New World documenting indigenous cultures, identified numerous specific correspondences between Plato's account and observed American characteristics. The discovery of advanced hydraulic engineering in various American cultures provided particularly striking parallels. The elaborate canal systems of the Aztec capital, the sophisticated irrigation networks of Andean civilizations, and the complex harbor facilities found at various coastal sites all demonstrated engineering capabilities that matched those attributed to Atlantis. The chronological difficulties posed by Plato's dating created significant challenges. Plato's placement of Atlantis around 9500 BC created obvious conflicts with biblical chronologies. Some scholars resolved this by arguing that Plato had misunderstood Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested the story referred to more recent events, artificially antiquated through oral transmission. The intellectual ferment of the 17th and 18th centuries transformed European approaches to ancient texts with unprecedented rigor. The scientific revolution's emphasis on empirical observation created new frameworks for evaluating historical narratives. Swedish scholar Olof Rudbeck emerged as perhaps the most ambitious proponent of Atlantis theories during this period. His monumental work, Atland, published in 4 volumes between 1679 and 1702, represented an extraordinary attempt to relocate Plato's lost civilization within Scandinavia. Rudbeck identified Sweden as the original Atlantis through complex philological arguments, tracing the name through various linguistic transformations to Atland, which he interpreted as an ancient designation for Swedish territory. He argued that classical authors had systematically misunderstood geographical references, placing Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, when original accounts actually referred to the Baltic Sea region. The archaeological evidence Rudbeck marshalled reflected the limited but growing knowledge of Scandinavian prehistory. He pointed to numerous Bronze Age burial mounds as evidence of an ancient civilization of extraordinary sophistication. The elaborate grave goods discovered in these burials suggested a level of cultural development that matched Plato's descriptions. Contemporary critics focused primarily on Rudbeck's philological methods and geographical assumptions. German scholar Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, despite general admiration for Rudbeck's erudition, expressed skepticism about the linguistic connections forming the foundation of the Swedish scholar's argument. French scholars of the early 18th century developed alternative approaches. Mathematician and geographer Philippe Boische proposed in 1737 that Atlantis had been located in the North Atlantic region, possibly corresponding to submerged land masses between Europe and North America. His theory drew on emerging oceanographic knowledge and geological speculation about past changes in sea level. Voltaire's treatment of the Atlantis narrative in his essay Sur les mœurs exemplified the Enlightenment's critical approach to ancient authorities. Rather than accepting Plato's account at face value or attempting to identify specific geographical locations, Voltaire subjected the narrative to systematic rational analysis that revealed numerous internal inconsistencies and implausibilities. The methodological innovations of 18th century historiography provided new tools for evaluating ancient texts. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire demonstrated how careful source criticism and systematic comparison could reveal the historical accuracy or inaccuracy of ancient claims. These methods, when applied to the Atlantis narrative, highlighted its unique character and isolation from other ancient historical traditions. The expansion of European knowledge about Pacific Ocean geography through James Cook's voyages provided fresh context. The discovery of sophisticated Polynesian civilizations demonstrated that advanced cultures could exist on remote islands. However, the absence of any archaeological evidence for large-scale civilization in the Atlantic region contrasted sharply with the abundant material remains of Pacific island cultures. The publication of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in 1882 marked a seismic shift in how the Western world understood Plato's ancient narrative. Ignatius Donnelly, a charismatic former congressman from Minnesota with no formal training in archaeology, produced a work that would fundamentally reshape popular conceptions of human prehistory. Donnelly's 500-page tome, dense with citations, maps, and comparative analyses, presented itself as rigorous scholarship while advancing theories that professional archaeologists found deeply problematic. His central thesis proposed that Plato's Atlantis had been a real, historical civilization whose destruction approximately 11,000 years ago had scattered survivors across the globe, carrying advanced knowledge that became the foundation for all subsequent human civilizations. The methodological approach Donnelly employed combined selective citation of legitimate archaeological sources with speculative interpretations that extended far beyond what evidence could support. He demonstrated remarkable industry in gathering comparative material from diverse cultures, citing everything from Aztec creation myths to Egyptian pyramid construction techniques to Celtic folklore. However, his analysis consistently emphasized superficial similarities while ignoring fundamental differences. He showed little concern for chronological context, essential for establishing actual historical connections. Donnelly's treatment of flood myths provided a representative example. He compiled extensive lists of flood narratives from cultures worldwide, noting apparent similarities in their descriptions of worldwide catastrophes. From these parallels, he argued that all flood myths preserve distorted memories of Atlantis's actual destruction, transmitted through oral traditions by scattered survivors. The linguistic evidence Donnelly marshaled reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of 19th century comparative philology. He identified numerous words from different language families that appeared to share common roots, arguing these similarities demonstrated descent from a common Atlantean linguistic ancestor. Professional linguists recognized that Donnelly's methods could prove virtually any desired linguistic relationship. The architectural parallels, forming another pillar of Donnelly's argument, drew on growing archaeological knowledge about ancient construction techniques. He noted that cultures as diverse as the ancient Egyptians, Mesoamerican civilizations, and various European megalithic builders had all constructed massive stone structures using sophisticated engineering techniques. These similarities, according to Donnelly, could only be explained by assuming all these cultures had inherited their architectural knowledge from Atlantean colonists. The impact on popular consciousness proved immediate and profound. The book went through multiple editions and translations, bringing Donnelly's theories to readers across Europe and America. Public lectures based on the book drew large audiences eager to hear about dramatic revelations that promised to revolutionize understanding of human history. The Victorian context made Donnelly's theories particularly appealing. The rapid pace of technological change and imperial expansion had created unprecedented awareness of human potential while raising questions about the permanence of civilizational achievements. Donnelly's narrative of a great civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe spoke to contemporary fears about the fragility of progress. Professional archaeologists uniformly rejected his theoretical framework and interpretive methods. The absence of archaeological evidence for any advanced civilization in the Atlantic region during the time period Donnelly proposed remained a fundamental obstacle. Regardless of superficial parallels he identified between different cultures, the archaeological record contradicted his claims. Yet the establishment of specific Atlantis tropes through Donnelly's work created lasting influences on popular culture that extended far beyond scholarly debates. His emphasis on advanced ancient technology, global catastrophic destruction, and the preservation of secret knowledge became standard elements in subsequent lost civilization narratives. The transformation from Donnelly's pseudo-archaeological construct into a cornerstone of modern occult doctrine began with Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's ambitious synthesis of Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and speculative anthropology in the 1880s. Blavatsky, a Russian aristocrat turned spiritual teacher, possessed extraordinary talent for weaving together disparate religious and philosophical traditions into comprehensive cosmological systems. Her monumental work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, elevated Atlantis from a lost civilization into a crucial stage in humanity's cosmic development. Blavatsky's approach differed fundamentally from Donnelly's archaeological methodology, drawing instead on claimed access to ancient wisdom preserved in Tibetan monasteries and transmitted through psychic revelation. She asserted that her teachings derived from the Akashic records, a cosmic repository of all human experience accessible through advanced spiritual development. The doctrine of root races formed the theoretical foundation of Blavatsky's Atlantis teachings. According to theosophical cosmology, humanity progressed through 7 distinct root races, each representing a different stage of physical and spiritual evolution, occurring over millions of years. The 4th root race, known as the Atlanteans, had inhabited Earth during a period when the planet's geography, climate, and spiritual conditions differed dramatically from contemporary circumstances. The Atlantean root race encompassed several sub-races that developed different characteristics over millions of years. The earliest Atlanteans were giants possessing natural psychic powers, direct communion with spiritual hierarchies, and technological capabilities operating through spiritual rather than mechanical principles. Blavatsky's description of Atlantean technology emphasized its integration with spiritual principles rather than mechanical engineering. The Atlanteans supposedly powered their vehicles and machinery through manipulation of subtle energies, using crystals and sound vibrations to achieve effects that contemporary technology accomplished through crude mechanical means. The decline and destruction of Atlantean civilization provided Blavatsky with a powerful illustration of the consequences of spiritual degeneracy and the misuse of occult knowledge. As the root race progressed through its evolutionary cycle, later generations gradually lost their natural spiritual abilities while retaining dangerous technological capabilities. The practice of black magic emerged during Atlantis' declining period as individuals began using spiritual knowledge for selfish purposes rather than cosmic service. The same psychic abilities and energy manipulation techniques that had created Atlantean civilization's golden age became tools for personal aggrandizement and domination. The final destruction occurred through a combination of natural catastrophes and the consequences of spiritual corruption. The misuse of spiritual forces had disrupted the subtle energy patterns maintaining the continent's physical stability. The Great Cataclysm represented both a natural geological process and a spiritual cleansing that removed a corrupted civilization whose continued existence would have hindered planetary evolution. Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophical interpretation of Atlantis built upon theosophical foundations while developing distinctive approaches to spiritual evolution. Steiner, who initially associated with the Theosophical Society before founding his own Anthroposophical Society in 1913, claimed direct spiritual perception of Atlantean civilization through developed supersensible faculties. Edgar Cayce's psychic readings about Atlantis, delivered during trance states between 1923 and 1944, provided the most detailed and influential modern account. Cayce, a photographer from Kentucky with no formal education in history or archaeology, claimed to access information about past lives and historical events through psychic means while unconscious. His 14,000 documented readings included over 700 references to Atlantis, creating a comprehensive narrative that combined theosophical concepts with distinctive American metaphysical traditions. The Atlantean civilization described in Cayce's readings spanned from approximately 200,000 to 10,000 BC, encompassing multiple technological and spiritual developments. The technology attributed to Atlantis centered on crystals for generating and focusing various forms of energy. The Great Crystal, serving as the primary power source, was described as a massive stone capable of concentrating solar and cosmic energies. The misuse of this crystal technology by later generations, who turned it toward destructive purposes, ultimately caused geological instabilities, leading to the continent's destruction. The systematic application of modern scientific methodology to Atlantis claims began in earnest during the early 20th century, as professional archaeology established rigorous standards for evidence evaluation. The archaeological investigation of Mediterranean Bronze Age civilizations initially seemed to support some aspects of Atlantis theories. The excavation of Minoan palaces on Crete by Sir Arthur Evans, beginning in 1900, revealed a sophisticated civilization that had flourished during the second millennium BC. The sudden collapse of Minoan civilization around 1450 BC, apparently caused by natural disasters combined with foreign invasion, provided a historical precedent for catastrophic civilizational destruction described in Plato's account. Evans himself initially drew explicit parallels between Minoan Crete and Plato's Atlantis. However, as investigation progressed and more sophisticated analytical methods were applied, apparent parallels began to dissolve. The chronological framework established through pottery analysis and radiocarbon dating placed Minoan civilization firmly within the second millennium BC, far removed from the 9500 BC date Plato specified for Atlantis. The geographical scale of Minoan influence, while impressive for its time period, remained limited to the eastern Mediterranean rather than encompassing the global empire that Plato attributed to Atlantis. More fundamentally, detailed analysis revealed characteristics contradicting essential elements of Plato's account. The development of underwater archaeology during the mid-20th century provided new opportunities to investigate claims about submerged Atlantean ruins. Jacques Cousteau's pioneering work with underwater exploration equipment during the 1940s and 1950s demonstrated the feasibility of systematic archaeological investigation beneath the ocean surface. The systematic survey of the Atlantic Ocean floor, conducted by various oceanographic institutions, produced detailed bathymetric maps revealing the actual topography of regions where Atlantis had been proposed to exist. These surveys demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean floor consisted primarily of abyssal plains lying at depths of 3,000 to 4,000 meters below sea level, with no evidence of recently submerged continental land masses. The geological analysis of Atlantic Ocean sediment cores provided additional evidence against the existence of any large landmass in the Atlantic during periods when Atlantis was supposed to have existed. Sediment layers revealed a consistent pattern of deep ocean deposition extending back millions of years, with no indication of the dramatic geological changes necessary to submerge a continent-sized landmass within the last 12,000 years. Investigation of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge System revealed the actual geological processes operating in the Atlantic Ocean. Seafloor spreading occurring along this underwater mountain chain was gradually expanding the ocean rather than submerging existing landmasses. The volcanic islands associated with the Mid-Atlantic Ridge represented recent geological formations created by volcanic activity rather than remnants of submerged continents. The search for Atlantean ruins in the Caribbean region produced numerous claims about underwater structures. The Bimini Road Formation off the Bahamas, first publicized in 1968, consisted of rectangular stone blocks arranged in linear patterns that some researchers interpreted as ancient roadways or building foundations. However, detailed geological analysis revealed that the rectangular blocks consisted of naturally fractured limestone that had broken along regular joint patterns due to geological stress and chemical weathering processes. The linear arrangement resulted from natural geological processes rather than human construction. Similar patterns of initial excitement followed by scientific debunking characterized numerous other claimed discoveries of underwater Atlantean ruins throughout the Atlantic and Caribbean regions. So after examining thousands of years of speculation, countless theories, and decades of scientific investigation, what can we actually conclude about Atlantis? The archaeological verdict is clear. No evidence exists for any advanced civilization in the Atlantic Ocean during the time periods proposed by various theories. The geological record contradicts claims about recently submerged continents. The historical record provides no corroboration for Plato's account outside his own writings. Yet the story refuses to die. And perhaps that tells us something more interesting than whether Atlantis actually existed. The persistent appeal of Atlantis across more than 2 millennia reveals fundamental aspects of human psychology. We're drawn to stories of lost wisdom, catastrophic destruction, and hidden knowledge because they speak to deep-seated needs and fears. The idea that an ancient civilization possessed capabilities exceeding our own offers hoped that current limitations might be transcended. The narrative of moral decline leading to catastrophic destruction provides a framework for understanding both individual and collective experiences of failure. The promise of secret knowledge waiting to be rediscovered satisfies our desire for comprehensive understanding in a world of fragmented, specialized expertise. Modern environmental concerns have given Atlantis new relevance. Climate change, ocean pollution, and ecological destruction provide contemporary parallels to the catastrophe that supposedly ended Atlantean civilization. The story becomes a cautionary tale about technological hubris and the consequences of ignoring natural limits. The democratization of knowledge through the internet has created unprecedented opportunities for alternative theories to flourish. Online communities dedicated to Atlantis research can share information and develop elaborate frameworks that operate independently of professional archaeological consensus. The emotional investment participants develop in these narratives creates self-reinforcing belief systems increasingly resistant to contradictory evidence. Whether Plato intended Atlantis as history, allegory, or something in between, his creation has taken on a life of its own. The story has been adapted, reinterpreted, and reimagined by countless cultures across diverse historical periods. It has inspired everything from serious archaeological expeditions to occult movements to blockbuster films. And in the end, perhaps the question, did Atlantis exist, is less important than understanding why we need it to exist. The story serves as a flexible metaphorical framework for exploring eternal questions about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between material progress and moral development. As we face unprecedented global challenges requiring both technological innovation and wisdom about the consequences of our choices, the Atlantis story remains relevant. Whether the lost civilization existed as Plato described, served as metaphor for political corruption, or functions as modern mythology about human potential, its central message speaks to our deepest concerns. So here we are, after examining ancient texts, archaeological evidence, geological surveys, and centuries of human imagination trying to solve this mystery. And if you're feeling uncertain about what to believe, that's exactly the right response. The truth is, I don't have a definitive answer about whether Atlantis existed. What I can tell you is this: Plato wrote something that has captivated human imagination for over 2,000 years. That alone is remarkable. What strikes me most isn't whether we'll ever find underwater ruins or definitive proof. It's what our endless fascination with Atlantis reveals about us. We want to believe that wisdom can be lost. We want to believe that great civilizations can fall. We want to believe that somewhere, hidden from view, answers to our deepest questions are waiting to be discovered. Maybe Atlantis was a real place, destroyed by geological catastrophe and erased from the archaeological record. Maybe it was Plato's elaborate thought experiment about the dangers of moral corruption. Maybe it's become something even more powerful, a mirror reflecting our own hopes and fears about human civilization. I want to know what you think, genuinely. After hearing the evidence, do you believe Atlantis was real? And here's the question that fascinates me most. If definitive proof emerged tomorrow that Atlantis never existed, would that make the story less valuable? Or has it already served its purpose by inspiring exploration, challenging assumptions, and reminding us that human achievement is always fragile? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you have expertise in archaeology, geology, or ancient history, I'd especially love to hear your perspective. Some of the most insightful discussions happen when people from different backgrounds bring their knowledge together. If this journey through one of history's greatest mysteries resonated with you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe. I explore these kinds of enduring questions, not to provide easy answers, but to honor the complexity of history and what these stories teach us about being human. And if you know someone who's fascinated by ancient civilizations or unsolved mysteries, share this with them. The best conversations happen when we explore these questions together. The search for Atlantis continues. Expeditions still launch, theories still emerge, and somewhere in our collective imagination, beneath azure waves, a lost civilization waits. Thank you for exploring this mystery with me. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, sometimes the questions we can't answer teach us more than the ones we can.